Hello everyone, my name is Luis Demarque and I'm a postdoc at the University of Toronto. And together with colleagues from Lancaster University and Aarhus University, I will present our work on comparing gaze, head, and controller selection of dynamically revealed targets in head-mounted displays. So selection is a fundamental task, and lots of studies have been performed where different modalities such as head pointing, controller pointing, and so on have been compared to each other. But focus so far has mainly been on selections within the field of view, so wherever the user can see every target that they have to select. And many of these works use this Fitts law as a basis for this, where the amplitude and the width of the target decides its difficulty, and you can calculate the throughput of each selection. However, in virtual reality and augmented reality, targets that you need to select may sometimes initially be outside your field of view. And this is called a dynamically revealed selection. And this sort of target selection consists of two phases. So in the first phase, the user has to move the target into the field of view or into the screen so that it's visible. And then in phase two, they have to select the target within the field of view. And here there's a trade-off for screen size. So a larger screen size leads to a shorter first phase, while a smaller screen leads to a shorter second phase. And there's been two models proposed which sort of expand on the Fitts law model to introduce this trade-off. And these are called peephole pointing and magic lens. And in general, these sort of selections have been mainly underexplored compared to selections within the field of view. But there are some exceptions of some work by Entz and colleagues where they compared these models for controller pointing and controller direct touch. And then there's also been some studies on search performance in VR. But so far, there's been lacking a study of comparing basic modalities for selection of dynamically revealed targets. And this is what we want to do in this paper. And in this paper, we compared head pointing, gaze pointing, and controller pointing. And these modalities are interesting because they each have different relationships to the HMD. So we have head pointing that is directly coupled to the HMD and follow the user's head movements one-to-one. You have gaze pointing, which is sort of semi-coupled to the HMD, where the user can freely point within the field of view, but you can't point outside the field of view. And then you have controller pointing, which is completely decoupled from the HMD, and the user can freely point outside the field of view and point at and select targets that are not visible. And we studied these modalities in a task where users have to select targets at different amplitudes and widths in a sort of back and forth fashion. So they have to start with a central target or a start target. They then have to move in the opposite direction to a target that will appear at some point. So this is a selection of where you have no prior knowledge of where the target will appear. And then they have to return to the previous target and select it again, which represents a selection where you sort of know where the target is going to appear like. So you have this sort of prior knowledge and without prior knowledge selections. And then we also changed the screen width because we know that has an effect. And in today's VR environment, there are lots of different sizes of HMDs. So in our study, we compared these three modalities. We also compared three different screen widths, different target amplitudes and target widths, and also whether the user has prior knowledge or without prior knowledge of the target position. So to go through the results, in contrast to previous work, we found that head pointing is actually significantly more erroneous than gaze and controller when selecting dynamically revealed targets. And this is possibly due to the head being used for both search and pointing, since it's a coupled modality. And we also found that the controller was more accurate than gaze, as shown in previous work. For reaching time, we found that gaze is by far the fastest to reach a target, while the controller is faster than the head. And these results are expected as the eyes move faster than other parts to guide our actions. An increased screen width also only benefits gaze and controller pointing, and this may be because these modalities are more independent from viewport control than the head. And we also find that users are slower in reaching targets when they have prior knowledge of the target location, as the initial movement is then more accurate. And no prior knowledge leads to users reaching the target faster, as then users perform large search movements. The head is slowest to select a target, so although the gaze reaches the target before the controller, there is no significant difference in movement time. An increase in screen width also only significantly affected movement time between 40 and 70 degree screen width. And this implies that there's a limit to the performance gained from increasing screen width. And finally, the head's movement time was actually not significantly slower than gaze and controller for larger targets in smaller field of view, implying that differences between modalities are only really shown when you have a larger screen. So overshooting of targets is less prevalent with prior knowledge of the target position, as has also been shown in previous work. Increasing screen width also only significantly affects overshooting time at smaller screen width. So we found a significance between 40 degrees and 70 degrees screen width, but not between 70 and 100 degrees screen width. And targets that are just outside the field of view had actually longer overshooting times than targets at further amplitudes, as targets appear early in the search movement. And the controller also had significantly less overshooting than gaze and head, while gaze had no significant differences. So here we can see individual trials for each modality and with and without prior knowledge. So we can see that for the controller, overshooting is rare, as we can see on this and this graph, as users can quickly select targets after finding it and reaching the target due to visual feedback during pointing. So you can kind of predict when the target will appear, when the cursor will appear on top of the target. For gaze, we can see that it's very quick to recover from an overshoot due to you not knowing the target position. However, as we can see here, there's a significant amount of time required to process the final cursor position before selection, as there is no visual feedback during gaze movement. So if you want to improve gaze pointing performance, making this part shorter could be a way to go to sort of fully leverage how fast the gaze reaches the target. And then finally, for head pointing, we can see that significant time is spent to change the direction of the movement and reaching the target to recover from the overshooting. But when they do that, they can quickly select the target, as again they have visual feedback of the target position. And then finally, for these sort of models that I first introduced earlier, we found that two-component peephole and magic lens models can accurately describe movement times for all modalities. We also found that Fitts' law accurately describes the movement time for all modalities at individual screen widths and when the user have prior knowledge of the target position. So this sort of conditions is very similar to the typical Fitts' law condition where the user knows how they have to move towards the target. And then finally, for head movement, we can find that prior knowledge of target position decreases head movement as movement can be planned in advance and you lower the chance of overshooting, and also that gaze and controller pointing do not actually increase the amount of head movement used, in contrast to head pointing, which requires a lot more head movement because you're also pointing with it. So sort of takeaways from this study: a decoupled pointer, in this case gaze and controller, is preferable for pointing and selection of dynamically revealed targets due to reduced overshooting. The differences between modalities become more apparent at larger screen widths, so at smaller screen widths, modalities are not that different. Prior knowledge led to faster selections due to less search and overshooting, and existing two-component models are good at predicting selection for all modalities. That is all from my talk. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in Sydney.